right? So before I start reading the interesting part, which is chapter 2, I'll read a good 15 pages today. I'm gonna babble on for a good, I don't know, 5 more minutes, because it only takes me a good like 40 minutes to read 15 pages. So I can babble on for a bit longer here. Right. So to end it off with my babbling before I start reading chapter 2, which is Shadow of the Past. Um, what else? Yeah, so I'm gonna keep saying this. Do not let Hollywood actors dupe you, as none of them are worth the royalties. Amazon's the only company who's worth my royalties because they're gonna be shipping my movies worldwide. They have warehouses all over India, New Zealand, Australia, all over Europe, Canada, the States, Mexico. They have warehouses everywhere, and they're a worldwide big company. They're one of the biggest companies in the world. There's a reason why Jeff Bezos is worth $200 billion because Amazon's a fucking huge company, man. They're a huge, huge company, obviously. Hence why what I want to partner with them, and I'm not going any higher or lower than 40%. That's my final offer. If you don't want to do business with me greedy, you're missing out. As I can easily just release my movie. I'm gonna tell Amazon, look, I can easily just release my movie on online, and I'll make more profit off that. Hence, you're missing out. Hence, why Amazon's gonna agree to the deal. Obviously, I put them in a pickle pretty much. Either you accept the deal and you reap the benefits from partnering with Sky Source, or you choose to be greedy and you miss out on your billions. And Ivan can just release his movie online and he'll make more money releasing online anyways. Yeah. The only good thing about online is I don't have to worry about shipping, but it's less professional. There's nothing worse than going on a website and you pay to watch it. It's very unprofessional. Hence why I want my movie. You won't get any covers for my movie, as I want my movies to have covers. My movie won't come with posters. Hence why I want to release my movies on Amazon. The way you get these nice shiny 4K Blu-ray covers for my 3 volumes. You get the nice beautiful 6 posters of some top notch. Right. So I'll babble on for a bit longer, and I'll start reading Lord of the Rings. And that's why my wife is so proud. It's because of me you get to live this amazing life, man. Yeah, my wife is rich. She's living a good life in Hollywood. But there's a difference between having, I don't know, a million in your bank and having billions in your bank. Victoria Justice doesn't know what it's like to live the billionaire life. Yeah, she's rich and she's living the multi-millionaire life. She has a nice house. She owns probably what, a 1 million, 1.3 million house, whatever it is. She owns nice cars, or whatever it is. She gets to travel around the world with her stepsister and family, but she gets to get nice clothes. But Victoria Justice has to watch how she spends her money. Whereas when you're a billionaire, you don't have to. When you're a billionaire, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You can get a whole new set of clothing. If the clothing is, you see a $5,000 outfit, you can easily buy it. You see a nice car that's $100,000, you can easily release it. I'm gonna tell her release your cars. But she gets to own her own jet, her own yacht. Victoria Justice doesn't own her own yacht. She doesn't own her own jet. She doesn't know what it's like to live the billionaire life. It won't be as new to her compared to me because I was completely poor. Hence, it's gonna be brand new to me completely. Whereas Victoria Justice got to live the rich life, but she doesn't know what it's like to live the billionaire life. Hence, why it's gonna be brand new to both of us. If Victoria Justice doesn't know what it's like to live the billionaire life, she doesn't know what it's like to own her own company bigger than the big Hollywood company. She doesn't know. She doesn't know what it's like to have all that. It's because of me, hence you're welcome. It's because of me you get to live this amazing life. And she cries every night, which is fucking annoying. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, seriously. Shut up. She cries every night. It's fucking annoying. And once I get this fee over with, I no longer have to worry about that fucking crying every night. Because it drives me nuts and it's fucking annoying. Because every day, I don't think Victoria Justice even sleeps. Because every time I go to bed, I always hear that crying all night long. And I'm like, man, when was the last time you fucking slept? It's fucking annoying. Hence why I can't wait to get this bullshit fee over. That way, the crying can cease and it can stop. Because Victoria Justice is fucking crazy, man. Yeah, she's my wife, but man, I didn't know she'd be that fucking crazy. Every night she fucking cries. It's fucking annoying, man. Like, shut up. Jesus Christ, man. Drives me nuts, man. And she keeps crying. Oh my god, man. Right? Let me stop babbling on. So I'm gonna end it off with, before my final announcement, I'm gonna end it off with Swimming the Sharks. You're looking at it at a very interesting view. I'm gonna talk about Amazon. Talk about Amazon. I'm gonna talk about the Hollywood actors. Do not let Hollywood actors dupe you. None of them are worth your royalties. And do not let Amazon do it, because Amazon's not worth any more than 4% of your world. I told you, if they're greedy, I'm just gonna release my movie online. I'm not gonna partner with them. I'm gonna be strict. I'm gonna look, man. This is my final offer. I'm not. There's no room for bargaining. I get 60. Scarface gets 60% of the pie. You get 40% of the pie, which is a good fucking deal, as you're gonna make billions of dollars off all my movies. And Jeff Bezos is only gonna get richer. Partner with Sky Source. As for my movie Zane, Amazon's gonna make a good like 2.8 billion, 2.7 billion. I'll make a good like 3.8, $4 billion worth of posters and movies. Because I'm gonna sell my posters separately from my movies now. Hence, that way I can be Amazon and Sky Source can make more money, obviously. As if I sell them together, I won't make as much money. That's why I'm gonna be smart. I'm gonna sell my posters separately. As soon as production's finished, a good month and a half later, I'm gonna let Amazon. I'm gonna have my photographers take all the pictures with the actors, obviously, and my scotches will send Amazon the file, and the posters will be ready for release on Amazon. For a good, the 6 posters for a good, I don't know, 80, $100, whatever it is. That's why Scotch is the best money in business. Yeah, man. Now I'm gonna read chapter 2. I've been babbling here for what, 36 minutes here, 38 minutes around there. I've been what? I'm gonna read chapter 2. Look at an interesting video here. Where is chapter 2? Excuse the noise. If you hear noise upstairs, because my stepmother is watching some church sermon. So if you hear noise, excuse the noise. So now I'm going to start. Chapter 2, Shadow of the Past. I'm going to read this with life. That way it's more interesting. So I'll read 15 pages here. So I'll read up to page 70. Up to page 70 I'll read, which is a good like 15, 16 pages, whatever it is. So this is going to be chapter 2, Shadow of the Past. I'm gonna say this. If I comment and I make errors, you have to bear with me, Lord of the Rings fans, Lord of the Rings nerds, as I'm not as well grounded in the story. I also wasn't born with an intelligent mind. Yeah, I'm pretty smart, but I told you, compared to a lot of people, I'm pretty stupid. I was born with a very creative mind, but I wasn't born with an intelligent mind. And that's why you have to bear with me, obviously. So now I'm going to start chapter 2, Shadow of the Past. Obviously, right? So the talk did not die down in 90 or 1199 days. The second disappearance of Mr. Baggins was discussed in A Hobbit, obviously. And indeed all of the Shire for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits. So people are still talking about what Bilbo's disappearance, obviously, right? Yeah, so people are discussing Bilbo's disappearance from the Shire, obviously, for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits, and eventually Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend and lived in long after all the true events were forgotten. But in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had at last gone quite mad, and had run off into the blue. There had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river and come to a tragic, but hardly an untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf, so people are blaming Gandalf for Bilbo's disappearance. Obviously, I believe this is what, a year later, whatever it is. All I know is that this is later, obviously. So Bilbo disappeared, and now everyone in Hobbiton are talking about his disappearance. They're blaming Gandalf for it. I don't know the exact time, how much time later it is. I don't know. I don't know the exact time. But all I know is that they're people in the Shire are discussing what Bilbo's disappearance. And they blame Gandalf for it. Obviously, if only that dreaded wizard will leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some Hobbit sense. They said, and to all appearance, the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down. But the growth of Hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddity. He refused to go into mourning, and the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 111th birthday. Yeah, so it's a year later, right? Which he called a 100-weight feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits say. Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up with the customs of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year. So year after year, Frodo would host a party for Bilbo in honor of his disappearance, whatever it is, right? Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up on the customs of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead when they asked, "Where is he then?" He shrugged his shoulders. He lived alone as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly the descendants of Old Took, who had children been fond of Bilbo, and often in and out of Bag End. Falco Bolfin and Frediger Bolger were two of these, but his closer friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin in the movie, obviously, right? And Merry Brandybuck. His real name was Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping over the so Pippin and Merry are Frodo's good friends, closest friends, obviously, right? Frodo went tramping over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folk, he was sometimes seen far from home walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Merry and Pippin suspected that he visited the elves at times, as Bilbo had done. So Merry and Pippin think Bilbo went to visit the elves, which he did, because when Frodo goes to Rivendell, he meets Bilbo, obviously, at Rivendell. Obviously, so Bilbo did go to meet the elves. So Merry and Pippin were right, thinking that Bilbo went to go visit the elves, obviously, as Bilbo ends up going to Rivendell, obviously. And don't forget that Merry and Pippin are significantly younger than Frodo, as Frodo was 50 years old when he leaves the Shire, and Merry and Pippin are younger than Frodo, obviously. Whereas in the movies, they have all of them look like in their 20s, but Frodo was mature when he leaves the Shire. He's like 50 years old. Whereas in the movies, they have him look like he's in his 20s. Right? As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit, just out of his tweens, so his 20s. So even though Frodo was 33 years old, he looked like a hobbit who was in his 20s. He was in good shape. He was healthy. He was energetic. You know what I'm saying? People of the Shire thought Frodo to be of wall preservation, obviously, just like they thought Bilbo to be of wall preservation. Because what? Because what? Because Bilbo had the ring, obviously. Bilbo was pretty much, he aged very slowly. And I think here's the interesting part here. I believe the reason why Frodo looked like in good preservation is because he had the ring. He now has the ring. And that's why he's looking really good, obviously, for a guy who's in his 30s, obviously, right? That's just my theory. There's some people, this is just a theory. That some people disagree with me with it. My theory is the reason why Frodo the reason why the people of the Shire saw Frodo looking as preservation is because Frodo now has the ring. Just like when Bilbo had the ring, he aged very well, obviously. Right? So as time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens. Some folk have all the luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 that he began to think queer. You see how I'm saying how Frodo was 50 years old when he leaves the Shire? Yeah, so this is years later. This is years later from when Bilbo first left the Shire and when Gandalf left the Shire. Remember how it ended off with Gandalf leaving and Frodo having the ring and Bilbo leaving? Now it's saying Frodo was nearing 50 years old, so it's 17 years later. So you have to keep that in mind, right? Whereas in the movies, they have him like he's in his 20s. As I told you, there's a lot of differences from the books and movies. Again, all the stuff that I'm reading, this is not in the movie, by the way. Obviously, the lead up to Gandalf meeting Frodo years later, and Frodo leaving the Shire, that's not in the movie, obviously, for pacing purposes, obviously. Right, so let me read this again. Some folk have all luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 they began to think it queer. Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years, he was quite happy. So this is years later, right? For some years, he was 17 years later, right? So for some years, he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future. But half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Frodo was suddenly growing. So Frodo wishes that he left with Frodo instead of staying in the Shire and having to deal with all these people, mumbling and murmuring about Bill's disappearance and blaming Gandalf and all that stuff, right? Master of Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years, he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future. But half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing, so Frodo was beginning to regret that he didn't leave with Bilbo, obviously. He found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. He began to say to himself, perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day, to which the other half of his mind always replied, not yet. So Frodo also wanted to go on an adventure too, obviously. As I told you, most of the hobbits are like cut off from the outside world, pretty much. They know about the elves and all stuff as they study some material as written in the prologue. But the Shire is pretty much the Hobbits' country, and they're cut off from the outside world, pretty much, right? Right. So it went on until his 40s were running out, and his 50th birthday was drawing near. So now it's 17 years later, right? 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant or ominous. Remember, Frodo was like 20 years old in the movies, whereas in the book he's like 50 years old. It was at any rate at that age that adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old path seemed to well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield, and more often by himself, and Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with strange warfares that began at this time to appear in the Shire. So people were showing up in the Shire, obviously, right? There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside. See, I told you, though the outside world is like what? Is like cut off from the Shire, pretty much. The what? The hobbits are cut off from the outside world, as mentioned here, obviously. There are rumors of strange things happening in the world outside. As Gandalf had not at the time appeared or sent in many messages for several years. Remember how I said Gandalf doesn't come back until many years later? Whereas in the movie they have him come back a couple days later. In the book, Gandalf doesn't come back until many years later. Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves who seldom walk in the Shire, so elves show up in the Shire obviously, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning, but they were leaving Middle Earth and were no longer concerned with its troubles. Remember that scene? Remember that scene when Frodo and Sam were like Grey Havens and you see the elves walking? I believe they get that passage from here. It said the elves were showing up in the Shire and they left. They were leaving Middle Earth. Remember how Sam's like, they're leaving Middle Earth? So I believe they got that idea from this passage here. I could be wrong. To all you book nerds, do not, if I make an error, do not hate me. I could be wrong, but I believe Peter Jackson got that passage from this passage here. Obviously, they were leaving Middle Earth and they were no longer concerned with its troubles. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens. Yeah, see the Grey Havens. And dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief sources of news from distant parts. So people did visit people like dwarves and what? Dwarves and elves visited what? The Shire every now and then, right? They were the hobbits' chief sources of news from distant parts. If they wanted any, as rules, dwarves and little and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries. So Frodo met up with the dwarves and the elves and all that stuff, right? During the build-up to Gandalf coming back and telling about the ring and him leaving the Shire, obviously. Seeking refuge in the west, they were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and of the land of Mordor. The names the Hobbit only knew in Legends of the Dark Path. See what I'm saying here? So just like in my book, Last of Zanus, Eretat, the Devil Wolf King, even though the Saladins know that Eretat, the Devil Wolf King exists, they see him as legends, as the wolves never what they never came to Cyrus or Saphis. Just like all the other lands like Mordor, they see it's like legends of the hobbits because the hobbits are cut off from the outside world pretty much. They know about the elves and the dwarves, as the dwarves and elves visit the Shire sometimes. But my point is that the hobbits are very ignorant of the outside world. Like I said earlier, obviously, right? The name the hobbits only knew in Legends of the Dark Past, like a shadow in the background. So it's like legends. Land of Mordor is like Legends of the Hobbits, obviously, right? Like a shadow in the background of their memories. But it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power of Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to reappear in great strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there was a power spreading far wide and away far east and south. There were wars and growing fears. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed, with dreadful weapons, and there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. See, right? Little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, But even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear queer tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. The conversation, the green dragon at Bywater, one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year. So Frodo's 50 years old now. So 17 years later, showed that even the comfortable heart of the Shire, rumors had been heard, though most hobbits still laughed at them. Sam Gamgee was sitting in one corner near the fire, and opposite him was Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, and there were various other music hobbits listening to their talk. Again, this is not in the movie, obviously, right? Right? Queer things you do not hear these days, to be sure, said Sam. Ah, said Ted, you do if you listen, but I can hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to. No doubt you can, retorted Sam, and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who'd invented the stories anywhere? Take dragons. So there's rumors about the dragon of Bywater, the green dragon of Bywater, circling around between Sam and what? And Ted, right? No doubt you can, retorted Sam, and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories anywhere? Take dragons now. No thank ye, said Ted. I won't. I heard tell of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green, he said, getting a general laugh. All right, said Sam, laughing with the rest. But what about these tree men, these giants as you might call them? They do say that one bigger than a tree was seen up away beyond in the North Moors not long ago. Who's they? My cousin Hall, for one. He works for Mr. Beaufort at the Overhill and goes over the North Farthing for the hunting. He saw one. Again, this is not in the movie, right? See what I say when I say this? The movie is different from the book. All these dialogues and scenes are cut out. But Peter Jackson had no choice, obviously. Hence why I believe they should have made 6 movies. That way we would have gotten the full gist. We would have gotten the full gist of J.R. Tolkien's book, obviously. Says he did, perhaps. Your Hell's always saying he's seen things, and maybe he sees things that ain't there. But this one was big as an elm tree, and walking 7 yards to stride, if it was an inch. Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree, as like as not. But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors. Then Hall can have seen one, said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping. The audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point. All the same, said Sam, you can't deny that others besides our half-fast have seen queer folk crossing the Shire, crossing it, mind you. There are more than that are turned back at the borders. The bounders have never been so busy before, and I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they are going to the harbors, out away beyond the White Towers. Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire, but it was an old tradition that away over there stood the Grey Havens, from which at times elven ships sail, never to return. Again, that's where Peter Jackson got the idea of what the elves sailing away, leaving Middle Earth to the Grey Havens, whatever it is, right? That's where Peter Jackson got that idea off in the movie, obviously. They are whaling, sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us, said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly. But Ted laughed. Well, that isn't anything new. If you believe the old tales, I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail, but I warn you, you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire. So pretty much Sam and Ted are talking about stories about the elves, about the green dragon, all that stuff, right? And the audience is laughing, all that stuff. Who cares, right? Yeah. The interesting part is when this part's all boring. The interesting part of this chapter is when Gandalf comes back and tells Frodo about the ring. That's when the story that's when this chapter, the part of this chapter picks up. And after that, it drags on with them walking and they meet all these people along the way. And that part's pretty boring, obviously. Right? Well, I don't know, said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and so hoped to see more one day. Of all the legends that he had heard in his early years, such as fragments of tales and half-remembered stories, remember, the outside world, the hobbits are pretty much cut off from the outside world. Even though they know the elves and all of them exist, they're cut off from the outside world. Hence why it's like legends and tales and stories have been told to them. Because they're cut off from the outside world, obviously. Right. Of all the legends that he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales and half-remembered stories about the elves, as the hobbits knew, had always moved him most deeply. There are some even in these parts, as know the fair folk and get news of them, he said. There's Mr. Baggins now that I work for. He told me that they were sailing and he knows a bit about elves. So Sam works for Frodo. He's his gardener, obviously, right? There's Mr. Baggins now that I work for. He told me that they were sailing and he knows a bit about elves. And old Mr. Bilbo knew more many of the talk I had with them when I was a little lad. Oh, they're both cracked, said Ted. Leastways, old Bilbo was cracked, and Frodo cracking. If that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friend, I'm off home. Your good health. He drained his mug and went out noisily. You might hear the noise upstairs. Excuse the noise. Sam sat silent and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do up in the Bag End garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow if the weather cleared. So Sam is Frodo's gardener, obviously, right? The grass was growing fast, but Sam had more on his mind than gardening. After a while, he sighed. Again, you're going to hear the noise in this video because my stepmother is watching something upstairs. It's excuse the noise. It might be a bit annoying, but you have to bear with me, man. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into night. He walked home under the early stars through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully, obviously. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. So Gandalf comes back 17 years later. So remember how I ended off chapter 1 when Gandalf leaves? I'm going to go get information. He leaves Frodo with the ring. Frodo grows up. You know what I'm saying? He grows up. 17 years later, he's 50 years old. He reached the age of maturity, and all the Hobbit are still talking about Bilbo's disappearance, and they're blaming Gandalf for Bilbo disappearing, obviously. Frodo wishes that he left with Bilbo 17 years earlier, and now Gandalf comes back after a long absence. Whereas in the movie, he comes back a couple days later. Whereas in the book, Gandalf comes back 17 years later, after 17 years later, after he gets information about the ring and all that stuff. Because even though Gandalf knew about the ring, he knew the ring had powers, he didn't really understand the ring fully. He didn't really understand the powers of the ring yet, obviously. Hence why he had to leave and get information. And he comes back and tells Frodo about the ring 7 years later. Let me read this again, okay? It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party, he had been away. So Gandalf. So in between those 17 years, Gandalf would leave and he'd come back and see Frodo. So I was a bit mistaken there. So in between the 17 years, Gandalf came back and he visited Frodo, obviously. But my point is, Gandalf doesn't come back when Gandalf tells Frodo about the ring. He doesn't come back until 17 years later. But in between those years, he came back and saw Frodo and stuff, like it says here, right? So for 3 years after the party, Gandalf came back and then he left again. And then he left and came back in between those years. And then 17 years later, he comes back and tells Frodo about the ring when Frodo's 50 years old. Right. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party, he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again, like I said earlier, right? During the next year or two, he had turned up fairly often, so he came back and forth, right? During the 17 years. Coming unexpectedly after dusk, whereas in the movie, they have him gone for a couple of days, and he comes back, whereas in the book, he comes back years later, obviously. Right. He will not discuss his own business and journeys and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly he visits and sees. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him. Yeah. So Gandalf visits Frodo. So Gandalf visits Frodo for what? So for 8 years, Gandalf was on and off visiting Frodo. So when I said 9 years, I was right. For 8 years, Gandalf visits Frodo on and off, obviously. And then after the 8th year, Gandalf doesn't come back till 9 years later. And he tells Frodo about the ring. So when I said 9 years, I was correct. I just didn't give you the context, obviously. Right. See, I actually do remember some stuff in Lord of the Rings. Yeah. So then suddenly his visit had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him. So for 8 years, Gandalf was visiting Frodo. Gandalf will leave and come back. And then after the 8th year, Frodo didn't see him for 9 years after that, because that's 17 years, obviously. Right? If my math is correct. So then suddenly his visit had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return and had given up on all interest in the hobbits. So Frodo thought Gandalf had given up on the Shire, and he thought that Gandalf would never. Frodo thought Gandalf would never, he would never see Gandalf again, and Gandalf would never come back to the Shire, obviously. So it took Gandalf years to get information about the ring. Whereas in the movie, when he goes to Gondor, he only leaves for a couple of days. So you know what I'm saying when I say there's a difference between the book and the movie? Yeah, man. Shut this camera off here soon. Right, so then suddenly his visit had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in the hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. This is when Gandalf tells Frodo about the ring, obviously. "Ah, well, said Gandalf. You look the same as ever, Frodo. So do you." So my guess is, based on Gandalf's comment, my guess is Frodo barely aged because of the ring. Obviously, that's my theory. My theory is Frodo he looked mature, but he barely aged because he had the ring. That's my theory, obviously, because Gandalf says here, "You look the same as ever, Frodo," because Frodo has the ring. "So do you," Frodo replied, but secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn, obviously. So Frodo said Gandalf looked good just to make him happy, when in reality Gandalf looked older, obviously, right? He thought Gandalf looked older. He pressed him for news of himself and of the wild world, and soon they were in deep talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the tree fingers. I'm going to show my camera here.